that we were not going to fight this war to win it, that we were going to fight it to some negotiated kind of peace.
Armistice talks began in July 1951, but got nowhere. Both sides found the other's attitude impossible.
이 공산주의자들하고 교섭이라고 하는 건 굉장히 어렵습니다.
Negotiation with the communists was very difficult. They treated the negotiations like a battlefield tactic, something to buy time.
그 사람네들은 시간 버는 것도 있고요.
One of the main stumbling blocks at the truce talks was the fate of the prisoners of war. Both North and South Koreans maltreated their prisoners. 1 in 3 American POWs held by the North Koreans died during the first winter.
A lot of them were lost to dysentery, diarrhea, severe beatings, malnutrition. Some of them were, stragglers. They were just beat with rifle bullets till they died, or bayoneted, or you either kept up or you died. It was that simple.
Concerned by the numbers dying, the Chinese took over control of the prisoners. They organized daily lectures to indoctrinate them.
They'd say, "We will tell you why you come to Korea, why you have come thousands of miles from your home to spill your blood for the profiteering warmongers on Wall Street, why you come here to lay down your young lives. They are sleeping with your wives and daughters. Do you think this is right?" And this would go on for days on end, hour on end, days on end, forever, continuously.
Back home, few people wanted to know.
Everybody was involved with World War II, but nobody was involved with Korea. The newspapers had so little in them. If I wanted to know what was going on in Korea yesterday, I would have to get the New York Times, because on page 2, they had a short column on the Korean War every day. But most of the other papers didn't, and you would only see headlines when there was a skirmish or if some hill had been lost or won, So there wasn't that interest. There really wasn't. It wasn't like Vietnam where you ate dinner and watched television and saw the latest battle. There wasn't anything like that.
In Japan, the Korean War galvanized the economy, generating $3.5 billion of spending. Japan, the ex-enemy, now became a bastion of capitalism in the struggle with communism in Asia.
Japan became the jumping-off place for the Korean War. The dockyards and shipyards were used to rebuild, recondition the ships. Japanese electronics, which are probably now the top of the world, really got their start in the Korean War.
In South Korea, the UN held 130,000 communist prisoners. Each one was asked if he wanted to return to his country of origin or stay in the non-communist world. The communists were outraged when almost half of the POWs chose not to return to their communist homes. Violent protest dogged the camps. When the armistice talks resumed at Panmunjom, the fate of the prisoners delayed the negotiations for months on end. As the truce talks stalled, the relentless bombing continued. American bombers dropped almost as much explosive on North Korea as they had on Germany during World War II.
The bombers came without warning. Too many people died because of the bombing. You found dead people everywhere.
길가에 가면 그 시체가 없는 데가 없었고, 그다음에
There was hardly a single house left standing.
집 하나, 온전한 집이 하나
They bombed the big cities, the villages, and the countryside in the same way.
농촌에 할 거 없이 몽땅 다
I saw it all with my own eyes.
이건 내가 직접 내가 눈으로 봤습니다.
Estimates suggest that in the north, as many as 2 million civilians were killed.
It was horrific. They said Stalingrad was destroyed 96% in the Second World War, but Pyongyang was destroyed 100%. Everything was burnt to ashes. Not a single house left.
Throughout the war, both sides committed horrible atrocities. Northerners killed Southerners accused of sympathizing with the enemy. Rhee's supporters massacred those suspected of being communists. In seemingly endless violence, innocent civilians were often the victims. At Panmunjom, the talking continued. Spanning 2 years, there were hundreds of meetings. (1952), election year in America. 2 years into the war, Truman decided not to run for the Democrats. The Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower. His slogan, "I shall go to Korea."
A lot of us were disenchanted with President Truman. I somehow blamed him for the war. So when the elections came up in 1952, I couldn't wait to vote for Eisenhower. I felt being a military man, and his pledge was that he would see what he could do to end that war, that he was the man I wanted in office.
Eisenhower defeated the Democrats in a landslide victory. There were changes in the East also. In March 1953, the communist world mourned the death of Stalin. Stalin had kept the war going. His successors wanted to end it.
Soviet and North Korean leaders came to believe it was impossible to win this war, because on the side of South Korea was the whole world, and on the North Korean side was the Soviet Union and China. So an armistice was inevitable.
A ceasefire was finally agreed on July 27, 1953. The Chinese, the North Koreans, and the UN backed the agreement. The South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, opposed the truce and refused to sign. The massive job of exchanging prisoners of war began. 75,000 communist prisoners were handed over. 12,000 United Nations POWs were also set free.
There's no words to describe how elated I was and my friends as we come across the line. It felt like tons had been lifted from your back. It felt like for the last 2.5 years I'd been carrying an enormous amount of weight, I mean tons. And all at once I could breathe, I was light, I was free. Freedom's something you can't describe.
Bernie Gehling also went home. Florence was there to meet him.
I'd only known him 6 months. We were only married 6 days. This young man who left with blonde, wavy hair came back with brown, straight hair, thinned. And he was gaunt. I mean, he no longer had the facial structure that he had when he left. This man that I had waited for 33 months. And then he comes home, and I don't really know him. But it didn't take long.
"54,000 Americans didn't go home. The war claimed the lives of 3,000 men from the armies of 15 other nations. In China, Mao called it a great victory, and the volunteers returned home as heroes. An estimated 500,000 Chinese soldiers had died in the war.
锻炼了那个中国志愿军，他在这一战场当中啊，
The volunteers demonstrated to the rest of the world that the Chinese were no longer the Chinese of the past.
不是过去的中国人，不能欺负他。狗与中国人
China could not be bullied.
这样子时代啊，已经过去了。
China was no longer the lame dog of Asia.
这个名称啊，也 pass 了，都过去了。
In North and South, 3 million Koreans were killed, wounded, or missing. Another 5 million were homeless.
53년도 정전 협정할 때
When the truce was negotiated in 1953, there was a chance for the Korean people to breathe.
조선인민들이 숨쉴 기회가 있다.
But there is no real victory in war. It kills so many people and destroys so much.
승리했다. 거기서 무슨 승리가 있어요?
No victory, but the West held the line. In Korea, communism had been contained.
In broad terms, it was a defeat for socialism. We were unable to impose the socialist system on South Korea, so it was a defeat.
Это поражение.
Forty years later, at the end of the Cold War, Korea was still divided by the same line.